The first thing Sheila Monroe noticed was the silence. It came on a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet that settles over a cul-de-sac at dusk when the kids are inside and the grills are put away. Sheila had sent the message at 6:14 p.m. She knew because she always checked the timestamp. She had made a habit of it over the past 11 months, noting when Heather Davis opened her messages, when she replied, when she left things sitting there unread for hours. The pattern mattered to Sheila. It told her where she stood. But this time the message showed no checkmark, no delivered, no read. Sheila set her phone down on the kitchen counter. She picked it up again. She refreshed the conversation window. She opened Instagram and scrolled to Heather's profile. The profile was still there, but the follow button had changed. It was no longer teal, it was gray. And below it, in the smaller text that Sheila had memorized like scripture, it no longer said following, it said follow. Sheila's hand began to shake. She opened a second app, then a third, then the fourth, and the fifth. By the time she reached the sixth, the messaging app she had downloaded only because Heather mentioned she used it, she was standing in her kitchen in the dark, phone flashlight on because she hadn't bothered to turn on the overhead, scrolling through a feed of names and photos of people who did not matter. Heather Davis had blocked her, on everything. Sheila stood there for a long time. Sheila Monroe was 46 years old. She had moved to the neighborhood 14 months earlier, into the yellow house at the end of Copper Lane that the previous owner had let go. The lawn was overgrown when she arrived. The paint was faded, but Sheila did not mind. Sheila had learned over decades to make do with what others left behind. She was a woman who had learned early that the world did not arrange itself around her wishes. Her mother had died when she was 9, her father had remarried when she was 11, and the new wife had a way of looking at Sheila that communicated, without ever saying it aloud, that she was not part of the plan. Sheila had learned to be quiet. She had learned to wait. She had learned that if she just stayed still long enough, people would eventually include her, or they would forget she was there. Both outcomes had happened, and she had stopped being able to tell the difference. When she moved to Copper Lane, she was hoping for a fresh start. The yellow house was cheap. The neighborhood was quiet. She told herself she didn't need anything from anyone. She told herself that as long as she kept to herself, nothing could be taken from her again. Then she met Heather Davis. Heather lived 2 doors down. She had a smile that came easy, and a way of waving from her porch that made Sheila feel, for the first time in years, like someone was genuinely glad to see her. Heather had lived on Copper Lane for 6 years. She knew everyone's name, everyone's dog's name, which houses had kids, and which ones were empty nesters. When she introduced herself to Sheila on that first warm Saturday in April, she mentioned that she'd noticed the moving truck the day before and wanted to welcome her. "I brought you some lemon bars," Heather said, "the neighbor tradition. Every new family gets lemon bars." Sheila almost cried. She didn't, but she came close. She stood in her doorway holding a foil pan of homemade lemon bars, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Someone had thought of her. Someone had made something for her. Someone had walked over on a Saturday morning to say, "You are welcome here." Sheila kept the foil pan. She washed it. She put it in her cabinet and looked at it every time she opened the door. It sat there for 3 weeks before she finally threw it away. The relationship between them began the way most friendships begin. Small things. A borrowed cup of sugar, a question about the trash schedule, a wave from the porch that turned into a 5-minute conversation, that turned into a 10-minute conversation, that turned into Heather saying, one afternoon in May, "I'm going to have a glass of wine on my porch if you want to join me." Sheila said yes. They sat on Heather's porch until midnight. They talked about nothing, about the neighborhood, about the summer heat, about Heather's job at the dentist's office, and Sheila's years doing billing for a HVAC company before it closed down. Heather was easy to talk to. She asked questions and actually waited for the answers. She remembered things Sheila mentioned 3 conversations later. She had a way of making Sheila feel like what she said mattered. For 3 months, they had wine on the porch 2 or 3 times a week. They texted during the day about small things, a funny car that drove by, a recipe Heather wanted to try, a question about whether Sheila had seen the same video online. They became the kind of friends who didn't need a reason to knock on each other's door. Sheila had not had a friend like this in years. She had forgotten what it felt like. She had forgotten that there was a word for the warmth that spreads through your chest when someone calls you and says, "I'm bored, want to come over?" She had been lonely for so long that she had stopped noticing it, and now that she could feel the absence of it, now that she knew what it was like to have someone, now the loneliness was back, and it was worse than before. She started texting Heather more, every morning, every night. She looked forward to Heather's replies the way she used to look forward to nothing at all. When Heather didn't reply right away, Sheila felt the silence like a physical thing. She would check her phone. She would check it again. She would draft messages and delete them. She would open the conversation, scroll through what they'd said, read it back like a novel she'd already read, looking for clues about what she'd done wrong. Heather noticed. It was hard not to notice. "Hey, I might be less available for a bit," Heather said one evening in late August. "Work is really busy, and Marcus and I have been trying to spend more time together." Sheila nodded. She said she understood. She drove home and sat in her car in the driveway for an hour, staring at the dashboard. She began texting again the next day. The message Sheila sent on that Tuesday evening was not, by her estimation, unusual. She had sent Heather a link to an article she'd found, a story about a woman in Arizona who'd gone viral for baking a cake in the shape of her neighbor's house. It was the kind of thing they used to share. A small, dumb, fun thing that didn't mean anything except that she'd seen it and thought of Heather. But Heather's silence had been growing longer for weeks. Her replies had become shorter. The wine on the porch had dried up. Heather had excuses, always different, always reasonable, always plausible. Sheila noticed every decline. She kept a mental list. She replayed their last real conversation, the one in late September when Heather had mentioned almost casually that she was feeling a bit suffocated lately and needed more space. Sheila had heard the words. She had not understood them. Not really. She had nodded and said that she understood, and Heather had smiled, and they'd finished their wine, and Sheila had gone home thinking that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. When Sheila refreshed her phone that Tuesday evening, the silence on every platform told her something she refused to accept. So she did what she had been doing for weeks without quite admitting it to herself. She went to Heather's front door. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the closed door. The lights were on inside. She could see the flicker of the television through the living room window. Heather was home. Heather was right there. And Heather was pretending she didn't exist. Sheila knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. She heard footsteps inside. Slow, unhurried. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. "Heather?" A long pause. "Heather, I know you're in there. I just want to talk." The door did not open. Sheila stood there. She knocked a third time. Her voice came out different now, harder, the words pressing against her teeth. "Heather, you can't just block me on everything. You can't just do that." The television volume inside went up. Heather had turned up the television to cover the sound of Sheila's voice. Sheila pressed her forehead against the door. She could feel the grain of the wood against her skin. She could hear the television on the other side, the muffled dialogue, the laugh track. She could hear Heather breathing on the other side of that door, close enough to touch, and Heather had chosen the television over her. She backed away from the door. She walked down the porch steps. She crossed the lawn. She did not run. She held herself together until she reached her front door, and then she went inside, and then she closed the door, and then she stood in her dark hallway and pressed her back against it and slid to the floor. She stayed there for a long time. On Wednesday, Sheila drove to the store and bought a new phone battery pack. She bought a SIM card at the CVS on Route 9. She came home and sat at her kitchen table and wrote down, in a notebook she'd bought for this purpose, every phone number she could remember for Heather Davis. The one she had from the texting app. The one from when they'd exchanged numbers in April. The backup number that Heather's husband Marcus had given her once, when they'd coordinated about a shared fence issue. She tried all three. Two of them rang and went to voicemail. The third, the one that belonged to Marcus, was disconnected. Sheila stared at the number written in her notebook. She drew a small circle around it. She drew a second circle around the first one. She pressed the pen so hard into the paper that it tore. Heather had changed her number. She had gone through the trouble and the paperwork of changing her number rather than answer a single call from Sheila Monroe. On Thursday, Sheila went to the dentist's office where Heather worked. She sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes, flipping through a magazine from 2019, until the receptionist politely informed her that Heather was with a patient and could not be interrupted. On Friday, Sheila saw Heather pulling out of the driveway. She ran to her car. She followed her. She followed her to the grocery store, to the post office, to a restaurant where Heather met Marcus for dinner. Sheila sat in her car in the parking lot, watching them through the window, watching them laugh and eat and exist in a world that no longer included her. She did not go inside. She did not approach. She sat and watched, and then she drove home and sat in her dark kitchen and waited for the phone to ring. It did not ring. On Saturday, she went back to Heather's house at noon. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. No answer. She went to the window and looked inside. The living room was empty. The kitchen was clean. She went to the back door and tried the handle. Locked. She went to the side window and put her hands up against the glass and looked into a room that told her nothing. A neighbor across the street came out to get his mail. He saw her standing at the window. He did not say anything. He went back inside. Sheila drove home. She lay on her bed. She did not sleep. On Sunday, she sent letters. She addressed them to the house on Copper Lane, to Heather Davis. She wrote 3 letters. In the first, she explained that she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. In the second, she asked Heather to please just talk to her one more time. In the third, she wrote a single line, "You owe me an explanation." She mailed them all. None of them came back. She checked the mailbox every day. She checked it in the morning and in the evening and before bed. She stood at the mailbox and looked inside, and there was nothing, and nothing, and nothing. Either Heather was intercepting them before they reached the mailbox, or she was opening them and throwing them away, or she had asked the post office to hold her mail, or she was simply not coming home at all. Heather had found a way to make herself unreachable, and Sheila Monroe was standing on the outside of that wall, with her hands open and her voice cracking, and no one on the other side willing to listen. On the morning of the shooting, Sheila woke up before dawn. She did not remember deciding to get up. She did not remember deciding anything. She lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, and the events of the past 19 days played through her mind in a sequence she could not stop. The silence, the grayed-out profile, the door that didn't open, the car in the parking lot, the letters that disappeared, the changed number, the closed blinds, the neighbor who looked away. The pattern was clear. Someone had decided that Sheila Monroe was not worth listening to. Someone had decided that she did not deserve an explanation. Someone had looked at her, at all the messages, all the time, all the effort, all the loneliness she had carried to that porch in April, and had decided that she was better off erased. Sheila got out of bed. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the drawer where she kept the kitchen knives. She looked at them for a long time. She picked up the largest one and held it in her hand and looked at the way the light caught the edge. She put it down. She picked it up again. She put it in a tote bag that she carried to the farmer's market sometimes. She zipped it closed. She went to the closet and pulled out a jacket, even though the morning was warm. She put the jacket on. She checked the bag one more time to make sure the knife was still there. She drove to Copper Lane. She parked across the street from Heather's house. The driveway was empty. Marcus's truck was gone. Sheila sat in her car and watched the house for 20 minutes. The porch light was off. The blinds were drawn. The door was closed. The same door she'd knocked on 9 times in 19 days. The same door she'd pressed her forehead against while Heather turned up the television. At 7:23 a.m., the front door opened. Heather Davis stepped out onto the porch in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, and that's when Sheila Monroe got out of the car. She crossed the street. She walked up the driveway. She walked up the porch steps. Heather saw her coming and her face changed. The ease drained out of it, the muscles shifted, and her hand tightened around the mug. Sheila reached the top step. Heather said, "Sheila, you need to leave." Sheila said, "You owe me an answer." Heather said, "I'm calling the police." Sheila said, "Call them." Heather turned toward the door. She took one step. She reached for the handle. Sheila Monroe reached into the tote bag. When the 911 call came in at 7:31 a.m., the dispatcher sent 2 units. The first officer arrived in 4 minutes. The second arrived in 7. By the time they reached Copper Lane, Heather Davis was on her porch with a wound to her chest that had already stopped bleeding because there was no blood left to give. She was 63 years old. She had lived in that house for 6 years. She had been making coffee on her porch for the last time. Sheila Monroe was still sitting on the porch steps when the officers arrived. She was not resisting. She was not running. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and the knife beside her on the concrete, and a look on her face that one of the responding officers would later describe in her report as completely vacant. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not ask for a lawyer. When the detective arrived an hour later, Sheila Monroe told her everything. She told her about the blocking. She told her about the messages that went nowhere. She told her about the letters and the phone calls and the parking lot and the door that wouldn't open. She told her about the night she stood in her hallway on the floor and the morning she put the knife in the bag. She told her all of it in the same flat voice, without inflection, as if she were reading from a script she'd memorized a long time ago. The detective wrote it all down. The investigation would take months. It would involve phone records and social media subpoenas and testimony from neighbors who had watched Sheila follow Heather to the grocery store and the post office and the restaurant. It would show a pattern of behavior that had escalated in the 19 days between the blocking and the shooting. It would show that Sheila had sent over 200 text messages in that period, many of which were never delivered because they were blocked, and that she had left 17 voicemails on numbers that no longer connected to anyone. The case file would note that Heather Davis had called her sister 2 weeks before the shooting and said, "I don't know how to make her understand that I need her to leave me alone." The case file would also note that on the morning of November 14th, Sheila Monroe left a note on her kitchen table before she drove to Copper Lane. It was written on a sheet of paper from the back of the notebook she'd bought at the store. It said 3 words: "She has to listen." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution argued impulse of passion, that Sheila had knowingly taken a weapon to Heather's home with the intent to harm her. The defense argued mental illness. The psychological evaluation presented by the defense described a woman with a dependent personality disorder so severe that the loss of Heather's friendship had become, in Sheila's mind, a threat to her sense of self. The blocking was not simply an inconvenience, it was an abandonment. And for Sheila Monroe, abandonment was not something that happened to other people. It was something that had defined her entire life, and she had not yet learned how to survive it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was second-degree murder. The sentence was 25 years. At the sentencing, Sheila Monroe stood and faced the courtroom and said something that the judge later described as one of the most coherent and disturbing statements I have heard in 30 years on the bench. Sheila said, "I did not want to hurt her. I wanted her to understand what she did to me. She made me think I mattered to her, and then she decided I didn't, and then she tried to make me disappear. I just wanted her to see me. I just wanted her to not pretend I didn't exist." She sat down. Heather Davis's husband Marcus sat in the 3rd row and stared at the floor. The neighborhood on Copper Lane has changed since then. The yellow house where Sheila Monroe lived has been sold twice. The current owners repainted it a sage green. They put new flower boxes in the windows. They are a young couple with a dog and a baby, and they wave at everyone who walks by. They do not know what happened in that house before they came. Most of the neighbors have stopped talking about it. It is easier that way. Heather Davis is buried in a cemetery on the east side of town, near a church she attended with Marcus on Sundays. Her headstone has her name, her dates, and a line from a poem she liked that her sister chose. It says, "She was real, she mattered, she was here." The file is closed now. The case number is 2023-CR-08471. The documents are in the courthouse records room, 3rd floor, filed under the name Monroe, Sheila D., and Davis, Heather M. Anyone can go and read them. Anyone can pull the timeline and the phone records and the statements and sit in that small room with the fluorescent lights and the humming ventilation and piece together what happened on Copper Lane on a Tuesday evening in November when a woman checked her phone and found that someone had chosen silence. Anyone who wants to know can know. That's the only thing the records can offer, the knowing, not the understanding, not the answer to the question that everyone who reads this story eventually asks. How does someone get to that point? The records don't answer that, but they don't look away either. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, a question, a reaction, a detail you can't stop thinking about, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if this kind of story is the kind you come here for, subscribe. Every week there's another file that deserves to be opened.